Hillary Clinton made her first visit to Egypt since the first democratically elected president was inaugurated. We ask, what leverage does the US have in Egypt as it seeks to build a new relationship with a country which has been a staunch ally for many decades? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu. The US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has met with the two central players in the power struggle playing out in Egypt. On Saturday, she held her first meeting with President Mohamed Morsi. He was sworn in 2 weeks ago as Egypt's first democratically elected president. Morsi is an Islamist who emerged from the country's long-oppressed Muslim Brotherhood movement. On Sunday, she met with Field Marshal Hussein Tantawi. As head of the military council, he's ruled Egypt for the last 16 months, but the transition to civilian rule has not been smooth. The military has retained overwhelming powers for itself, including legislative power and control of the writing of a new constitution. So the United States faces many difficulties when it comes to dealing with a post-Mubarak Egypt, not least its attempt to wield its influence amid the competing political power struggles, and making sure that Egypt respects its international agreements, especially its treaty with Israel. Eager to be seen as a champion of democracy and human rights, the US has criticized Egypt's military as it grabs more power, and it has offered words of support for the Muslim Brotherhood. This makes those who are skeptical of the Brotherhood's intentions uncomfortable. That discomfort manifested itself in protests at the weekend. On Sunday, some threw tomatoes, water bottles and shoes at her motorcade as she left a ceremony marking the opening of a new US consulate in Alexandria. Earlier, I spoke to Abdul Magud Dadri, an MP who represents Luxor for the Freedom and Justice Party. I asked him what the visit by the US Secretary of State achieved.
It emphasized the support of the American administration to the Egyptian democracy and to the election of President Morsi as the president of Egypt, and also the importance of Egypt's stability for the United States of America.
So, do you trust the United States when it says, through Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, that it would like to see a full democracy in Egypt under civilian rule?
If you ask me about our experience in Egypt, the answer is no. A straight no, because unfortunately the United States administration for the past 60 years has been supporting dictatorship in the Arab and Muslim world. From what they saw happening in the Arab Spring, I think the people in the Arab world have spoken, and the United States administration has to listen to the voices of the people, and they have no other option but to support democracy in Egypt as well as in the Arab world.
So what gives you reason to believe Secretary of State Clinton right now? Because, you know, the United States continues to give money to the military. Egypt is the second biggest recipient of US foreign aid. That continues to happen. In fact, it was US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's very department that granted that waiver, which enables money to go to the Egyptian military.
Egyptians now are for democracy 100%. And if the United States is trying to play with the military to keep a special place in the Egyptian politics, I think they'll be making a big mistake to the foreign policy and to the Egyptian democracy. I base my analysis on the power of the Egyptian voice rather than the support of the United States.
What did President Mohamed Morsi ask of the United States? What does he want Washington to do?
He wants them to respect democracy, to build a new system of relationship based on mutual understanding and mutual respect. If the United States understands this message, I think we're likely to have better relations between the Egyptian people and the American people. That is likely to present a better alternative than what they used to have with ex-dictator Mubarak.
Okay, Dr. Dadri, what is the prevailing sentiment among the Islamist parties in Egypt on the peace treaty with Israel? Do they want it to remain as it is? Would they like it to be renegotiated or scrapped altogether?
Egyptians since 1979, when the Camp David Accord took place, there have been the so-called cold peace. there has not really been active peace between the people of Egypt. It was always between the Egyptian dictatorship and the Israelis. Now I think the Israelis have a better chance to keep their side of the treaty so that they can avoid any review of the whole Camp David Accords.
So, what influence does the U.S. have in a post-Mubarak Egypt? To discuss this, I'm joined by Hilary Mann Leverett, professor at American University and former White House and State Department official. Shibli Tilhami, professor for peace and development at the University of Maryland. And also joining us is Abdullah al-Arian, professor of Middle East history at Wayne State University. Welcome to all of you to the show. So, it would appear that Egypt is undergoing a period of great uncertainty right now, which is actually understating it. There is a power struggle going on between the president and the military. So, Hillary, why did the U.S. Secretary of State decide to go to Egypt now? Would it not have been better for her to let the dust settle? I mean, it's very soon after the election and the inauguration. Let the dust settle so you can see very clearly the contours of this power struggle and then go.
I think it would have been wise to wait, not only to see what was happening in Egypt, but also to not feed the perception that the United States was a pernicious, interfering actor in the politics of Egypt, which it has been an imposing, interfering actor for more than 30 years. If it had just given some space to the political actors in Egypt, it could have potentially eased the impression that it was such a pernicious, interfering actor. But instead, Secretary Clinton decided to go, and not just go, but she goes and she very publicly gives a message of what she told the military what to do. And clearly there were a lot of implications of what she told the president of Egypt what to do. And I think this just further aggravated the notion that the United States will continue its 30-year plus policy of not being able to deal with a strong, independent Egypt and not really accepting its democratization and its inevitable rise. And unfortunately, this comes at a time of declining U.S. influence when we're not able to really affect any of our goals in the region, which makes this appear even more tragic.
Okay, let's take a listen to what she said about the role of the military in Egypt. Hillary Clinton made it clear that she wants the Egyptian army, better known by its acronym SCAF, to withdraw from politics. Let's take a listen to what she said.
The United States supports the full transition to civilian rule with all that entails. And we have commended the SCAF for representing the Egyptian people in the revolution, as compared to what we're seeing in Syria, which is the military murdering their own people. The SCAF here protected the Egyptian nation, and we commend them for overseeing a free, fair election process. But there is more work ahead.
Shibli Tilhami, are these just words coming from Hillary Clinton? Because Or does it mark a major departure as far as the United States support?
Well, I don't think it's just words, but let's go back to the issue of the timing of the visit. I mean, obviously one can make an argument against it, and particularly because this is not about Washington. It shouldn't become about Washington. Certainly, Washington cannot afford to have the appearance that it's trying to manipulate an outcome in Egypt. No doubt about that. But just to put it aside, had she not visited, or had there not been a high-level American visit to Egypt anytime soon, there would have been criticism of being ignored. So I don't think the issue of criticism is tied to this logic. Frankly, I think once the president had issued an invitation to President Morsi to come here early fall, they have to create some links and some preparation for this visit. So. I think you can make a very strong argument the U.S. had to really start a dialogue prior to Morsi's visit to the White House. Also, Hillary Clinton was going to go to Israel for a variety of other reasons. Some of them may have been political, tied to our election campaign. Some of them have to do with Iran. It's a complicated picture. It would have been also odd if she had gone there and not gone to Egypt. So I think you can make that argument. But in terms of what Hillary Clinton says, I actually believe that when you say the U.S., it's a complicated bureaucracy. There's Congress, there's the White House, there's the State Department. I don't think there's one view of what's happening in the Arab world or one view of what's happening in Egypt. But I do believe that the Secretary of State and the President genuinely want to see a full implementation of democracy in Egypt, even as it is true that most within the American bureaucracies and Congress see the military as an instrument of influence in Egypt. No doubt about that.
Right.
And they're caught between those two tendencies of supporting. And I would argue that on the eve of the announcement of that Morsi won the election, when people were doubting that it was going to happen, where the people were suspicious the military may be manipulating a different outcome,
right,
the U.S. position vis-a-vis the military was to pressure them to declare whoever the winner is, and until the last minute.
Yeah.
With,
Okay, let me just go to Abdullah for a moment.
With all due respect, though, to Professor Talhami, who I do have enormous respect for, this idea that the United States supports democracy in Egypt, that it has ever supported democracy in Egypt, I think it's a bit more of wishful thinking than it is actual evidence on the ground.
Okay, let me just go to Abdullah. I'll get back to you, Hillary. Abdullah, to what extent will this visit by Hillary Clinton and what she's saying over there be construed by Egyptians as interference in the domestic affairs of Egypt?
Well, I think it absolutely would be. I mean, if we even put aside for a moment the entire credibility gap, the fact that the United States has not been in favor of democratic rule in the Middle East for several decades, putting that aside and just assuming that perhaps this administration tried to generate some goodwill and, start a new page with the people of the region, we still haven't seen enough signals coming from this administration. We've seen, by all accounts, the coverage of this visit has been one of a very muted message on the part of the administration. We just heard the Secretary of State say that she admires the SCAF at a time when the disapproval among all Egyptians of what the SCAF has been doing in terms of its power grab, trying to acquire as many of the powers of the presidency for themselves, and denying Morsi the opportunity to actually try his hand at governance. And we haven't seen any real critiques of that from this administration, and I think for that reason alone, we've seen that the SCAF has perhaps been even emboldened. All kind of showmanship aside, the idea that the SCAF is somehow offended by some of the words coming from this administration, I think the actual reality is that they feel emboldened by the fact that not only has there not been real condemnation, but we've seen things like, for instance, the U.S. aid package that goes directly to the military has not been under any serious consideration of or threatened with having been withdrawn up to this point.
Right, Hillary, you've had a long experience with Egypt. You've been a student there. You've been a diplomat there. Is Hillary Clinton trying to satisfy both sides here?
I think she's trying to satisfy domestic political constituencies here in Washington. I think it's an entirely Washington-focused visit, as Professor Talhami pointed out, linked very much to Israel. And I think very unfortunately, what it does is it groups together and reinforces for Egyptians the fact that since Camp David, Egypt has been, in U.S. foreign policy terms, a subordinate country and intended to be subordinate to Israeli interests and how they're perceived from Washington. And so the visit there today was not only what she said about the SCAF, which I agree with my colleagues, was inappropriate in the Egyptian context. Not only is it about the United States interfering in the domestic politics of Egypt, but very unfortunately, it reinforces this message that since Camp David, Egypt has been subordinated to Israeli interests. That is something the United States is going to need to face up to in a democratic, rising Egypt when the United States' own influence is declining, something we have not even come close to coming to terms with. While Egyptians don't want a war with Israel, I don't think they want to kill anybody by and large. The Camp David Treaty, not only as it was signed, but as it was implemented, and the decisions that the United States pushed the Mubarak government to implement with these same people in the SCAF, that's going to come under very close scrutiny for any democratizing polity in Egypt, and we're not going to like the outcome, and we need to deal with it sooner rather than later.
As we heard from that member of parliament at the outset of the show that we interviewed, do you believe that to be the case?
Well, first of all, on the issue of democracy, I just want to clarify, because I'm the one who's been arguing all these years that the democracy is not a priority in American foreign policy. Even when the U.S. tries it, other interests will supersede, both domestic and foreign. So that's not an issue. What I was saying is that the president's instinct and the secretary's instinct actually is to support democracy, and then they run against interests that they have.
But Hillary Clinton herself said that Mubarak is not a dictator when the events were unfolding. Vice President Biden said he's not a dictator because he's friends with Israel.
But they caught
this idea that they have the instinct, I'm sorry, it's just not supported by the evidence.
But they caught between these obvious facts. But let's put it aside. The U.S. is not central to the outcome in Egypt. Whatever happens in Egypt will happen with or without the U.S. The appearances matter, but frankly, at this point, there is nothing the U.S. can do to satisfy the Egyptian public, because the Egyptian public will judge America primarily on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. By all the polls show that. There's no way the U.S. is going to win the heart and mind of the Egyptians separate from that. So what the administration has to do is figure out how it can have some working relationship with whoever emerges in power in Egypt. So for now, up until the time that they have to deal with it, yes, there are domestic political considerations, and there are obviously significant implications strategically for the U.S. no matter what happens in Egypt. But the U.S. has to figure out a way of working with the new president, working with an elected parliament, working with the military, whose role it cannot ignore. And so all of that is complex, and I don't think you can ignore it, because even if you anger public opinion, I would argue that this is the new Egypt. It's an open Egypt, an Egypt that is freer, and you're going to have manifestations. The Egyptian public was angry with the U.S. before the revolution, during the revolution, after the revolution, and as I said, it'll remain so as long as the Israel-Palestine question remains unresolved. Yeah. But what we see now is that more capacity for people to express themselves. So when Hillary Clinton goes out, then you're going to have a demonstration. It's not new anger. It's been there all along. It's now going to manifest itself.
And we do have one segment of the Egyptian population which is now protesting, saying that the United States is handing power to whom they call jihadists in Egypt right now. Let me go back to Abdullah. Abdullah, I'm wondering if we can take with any seriousness what Hillary Clinton has been saying in Egypt. She said, we promote human rights, we work for an end to the emergency law and an end to political prisoners being detained. When the U.S. fully embraced the former regime that did all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think the United States has any credibility in that department whatsoever, not only for endorsing a regime that's been violating all of these or committing all these human rights abuses for all of these years, but also as the United States continues to commit its own human rights abuses, and a record that has now become firmly established across the world. And so I think the real issue is not necessarily what kind of human rights message that the Secretary of State is carrying into Egypt, but more likely we should be examining what are the U.S. goals and what are the U.S. actual interests in Egypt. And those are the things that I think I would disagree with Professor Tarhami in that regard. And I do think the U.S. can actually shape part of the outcome of what happens in Egypt. We've seen that the actors on the ground in Egypt are quite concerned with the posture of the United States toward them. The Muslim Brotherhood thus far has always acted with total consciousness of how the U.S. might respond to its various actions. We've seen that the military leaders are emboldened at various moments based on the U.S. inaction toward many of its moves. And I think perhaps going forward we need to look at the way that the United States tries to affect certain outcomes, especially when we look at issues like political isolation, economic isolation that could threaten to undo the democratic process, or at least the democratic gains made by the Muslim Brotherhood and their president. I don't think it's any coincidence that President Morsi made his first actual state visit to Saudi Arabia, where he is now going to be dependent on economic aid. That economic aid will be contingent on on Egypt basically playing the regional game in favor of the kind of U.S., Israel, and Saudi alliance. That means things like isolating Iran, continuing to be on that side of the issue, not threatening the status quo with regard to the Palestinian question, and many other considerations that I think that the Egyptian government currently knows that it has to play ball on those considerations, or else threaten to be politically and economically isolated.
Okay, Hillary, what kind of leverage does Washington have?
Well, it's very interesting. I'm just back from a few weeks in China at Peking University, and the way they look at it, it's fascinating. They see the decades-long policy toward Egypt as one of creating these dependencies that my colleague just addressed, creating these dependencies in order to keep Egypt in this subordinate state to U.S. policy preferences, which, as Professor Tahami and my colleague have said, go really against the grain of what Egyptians think, believe, and really want out of their lives. The U.S. aid has engendered these dependencies in order to make sure that the government takes decisions it would never take if it were democratically elected or accountable. The Chinese idea is, instead of trying to create these dependencies through aid, is to actually work with Egypt for development, to help create jobs, to work for development, but not for aid. But that's something here that doesn't get touched, not because we have any real security interest in Egypt's military doing something for us in the Middle East that we need, but because it's so tied to the military aid to Israel. And that is a nut here that's not going to be cracked. And in the meantime, we will continue to essentially wholly own and operate the Egyptian military in a way that will continue to keep Egyptians down. And it keeps them down on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but also it keeps them down in terms of what we used to call call the global war on terror, which still disproportionately affects Egyptians, Egyptian Americans, of course, Arabs and Muslims worldwide, but still disproportionately affects them. So that's why you have President Morsi coming out in a way that I think shocked many Americans, raising the issue of Sheikh Omar Abdurrahman, who is in jail here in North Carolina.
Right.
For Americans, we think that's crazy. How could he do that? But it really disregards the really deep impact that the war on terrorism had on Egyptians, on Americans of Egyptian descent and people who had come here. Those are issues that will be raised, and we need to deal with them seriously and constructively, and not just dismiss them as the words of crazy jihadists, as you hear here.
Right.
Those are going to be critical elements in a constructive U.S. policy going forward. We're going to have to let Egypt rise with other important players in the region like Iran, and we're going to have to deal with them not only seriously in the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but so that they're not implementing this siege of a civilian population in Gaza. Those are all things that are extremely difficult for the American politics to digest.
Okay. Professor, will the new President Morsi, will he wait for some time until he can consolidate his power before flexing any kind of diplomatic muscle insofar as the United States is concerned, or Israel is concerned, or the peace treaty is concerned?
My own sense so far, I mean, looking at the Brotherhood strategy by and large, but also Morsi, is not to rock the boat internationally and try to create the challenges to consolidate power at home and sort of pacify the external, he has a constituency to deal with. And what's working for him right now is there's no major violence on the Israel-Palestine issue. If there was real conflict right now, he just cannot avoid dealing with it because his constituency is very much in favor of supporting the Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, and taking on the Israelis, and we know that from public opinion polls. So I think he's avoiding it because there is, the environment isn't really right now, pushing him in that direction. I think he would rather not. He understands that he has an economic task to accomplish here. They need to build. They want to generate foreign aid. They want to bring investment. So I don't think he's going to deviate much from his position on foreign policy, but I think he's not going to rock the boat until he can figure out.
So do you agree with Hillary then that he's going to be maneuvered into a position, maybe against his will, but where he will be constantly under U.S. influence?
I think he's going to, before long, there will be significant challenges in the relationship between Egypt and the United States, undoubtedly. It's just unavoidable because I think right now, from what's different about Egypt now from 2 years ago, it has a government that has to be responsive to public opinion. And public opinion is very much on the other side of many issues of American foreign policy. And everybody is busy right now in Egypt because of dealing with the internal affairs and also with the Arab Spring broadly. But when the issues come, choice, whether there's confrontation with Iran, whether there is confrontation with Israel and Palestinians, or for that matter, Israel and Hezbollah, all of that is going to come. The challenges are going to be enormous, in my opinion. They're not small, they're big.
Okay. Hillary?
And this is precisely the reason why I think that President Obama and Secretary Clinton, for all of their supporters here in Washington, believe are not interested in democracy, because the concerns that Egyptians have are real, they're important, they're legitimate. The treatment of the civilian population in Gaza, number one. The treatment of other Muslim countries, Iran, Afghanistan, Iraq, all of these invasions and bullying have really impacted Egyptian sentiments, and the treatment of Egyptians, Arabs, Muslims more broadly in the war on terror. That has plummeted the opinion of U.S. policy in Egypt. Those are real, important, legitimate concerns, and they will be reflected in democratic outcome. But these are all issues that President Obama and Secretary Clinton think the U.S. is on the right side of. We're on the right side of history in supporting what Israel is doing. We're on the right side of history in combating Iran. We're on the right side of history in making a global war on terror that goes into other countries and kills people. That's not supporting democracy. They can't support democracy, and therefore what Professor Tahami said, I think, in terms of this inevitable clash will certainly arise over time.
Let me go to Abdullah for the last word. We've run out of time. We've got 30 seconds here. Do you believe that the generals in Egypt are sensitive to U.S. opinion, U.S. views, U.S. desires, or do they feel we hold all the cards right now?
I don't think they're that sensitive to any criticism that may arise, because I think they're quite aware that when push comes to shove, the United States will not be in a position to actually withdraw the aid, because they need that aid as the lever that keeps the Israel-Egyptian treaty in place. And I think that they know that deep down, as Hillary just mentioned, that the U.S. interests are the same interest as the militaries. I think what we've really seen in the United States is a shift in the last few years, probably even predating this administration, in which perhaps, yes, there's been less of a demand for supporting dictatorships, but we're supporting democratic outcomes as long as we can manipulate those in the United States to continue to support U.S. goals in the region.
As long as it's
should it be the Muslim Brotherhood or any other force, as long as they can be co-opted into continuing to produce the same results, then I think that's the position of this administration.
And always in the interest of the United States, right?
Yes.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And that is it from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And of course, we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send us your ideas directly at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching.